Okay, hi, I'm Steve Vertovec, and this is going to be the keynote lecture for the IMISCOE Conference, which was actually at the end of June 2017. And due to a kind of fluky injury, I wasn't able to do that. So now we're filming this in our library hall here at the Max Planck Institute, and it's still the talk that I would have given at the IMISCOE Conference. I hope you find it interesting. Quick couple of words about the title. This year, at the 2017 IMISCOE Conference, the theme for the whole conference was urban diversity, and I was to give the opening keynote lecture for that. So I saw it as my kind of task is to get people thinking in different ways about urban diversity. So that lies behind a lot of what I'm going to be saying. And then there's the subtitle, What's the Matter with Rotterdam? The IMISCOE 2017 conference was in Rotterdam, so I thought it would be fun, maybe a little bit mischievous, to use Rotterdam as an example for some of the things I wanted to talk about. And so first kind of health warning is, I don't know anything about Rotterdam, really. I know a lot of people who do, and I ran past my argument and data with them. They seem to buy it, but I know that there's a lot more people who know about Rotterdam, who know about urban politics and so forth. Might well disagree with what I say, which is perfectly fine and good. The main thing is, again, I get everybody thinking about urban diversity in different sorts of ways. So, structure of the talk, I'm just going to open with a general question of some things that interest or worry me these days out there concerning diversity in politics and so forth. And then I'll go on to talk about urban about cosmopolitanism in cities, and talk about something which I'm calling a fear of diversification, and then I'll come to the Rotterdam example to try to pull all this stuff together, and then end with some concluding thoughts. So, sorry to start off the talk on such a sour note with these kinds of examples, but we've obviously seen in the last year plus a lot of anti-immigrant discourses in politics, in highbrow politics and so forth. And the thing that I find interesting, well, first I ask myself, why are these narratives by Trump, by Wilders, by the whole UKIP people, by Pegida and various anti-immigrant movements in Germany, why do these narratives hit home for some people and not for others? That's the first kind of broad question. But then when we think about cities, we know worldwide that generally in cities, these sort of messages don't have the same take, the same popularity as they do in non-urban places. So that's the next question. Why in cities don't they generally have much popularity? So this is the general line of discussion I'll have in this talk. It's a common tenet in a lot of social sciences these days, and I'll go through a kind of potted history of social science on urban cosmopolitanism. But it's a widespread expectation that cities are kind of generators of cosmopolitanism. And I'll give a potted definition in a minute of that as well. There's a lot of evidence for this, again, in a lot of particularly Western developed countries, but I'm thinking possibly in a lot of non-Western countries as well. Social science research, opinion polls, voting behavior, we see that people think differently about issues of immigration and diversity in cities than in non-cities. However, there are certain places in cities and certain cities writ large where you do have more, let's say, xenophobic or anti-immigrant sentiments. And it just happens, I think, that Rotterdam is one of those places, and I'll be giving evidence for that sort of thing. For instance, Rotterdam is where Pim Fortuyn came from, a very famous right-wing populist politician who was assassinated in the early 2000s. Nevertheless, the party that he was part of remains the largest in the Rotterdam City Council, right-wing populist, largely anti-immigrant party. And in all of the Netherlands, the vote for Geert Wilders was highest in Rotterdam of all cities as well. He actually almost won Rotterdam in the last elections, early 2017. So I just lay this out there again as an intriguing question to get us going. How do we understand the trend, the general expectation of urban cosmopolitanism, cities as generators of something we call cosmopolitanism, but also these counter trends that sometimes cities generate xenophobia. Again, getting us thinking about urban diversity.
Before I proceed with the rest of the lecture, I have to say that here I'm rather constrained to address urban diversity mostly in terms of ethnic and racial diversity, and this is just due to the limited statistical categories I've had to use regarding the cities that I'll be talking about. Of course, a more complete treatment of urban diversity should naturally include the intersection of ethnic and racial categories with things like gender, age, language, religion, sexuality, legal status, all the kind of dimensions of urban superdiversity that I've talked about elsewhere in publications and lectures.
All right, so here's the potted definition. I don't want to go into it. There's a massive literature on cosmopolitanism. I've published some stuff on that myself. Just to keep it short, and for the purpose of this presentation, I'll just call it Cosmo, urban Cosmo. We generally talk about non-bias or generally positive attitude towards out-group members. You can tell I've been hanging around with social psychologists a little bit. This is adopting their language. Generally, we understand cosmopolitanism as some kind of openness to others or to otherness or to strangeness, a willingness to engage others, leading to what are generally kind of banal interactions between people on the street in public places as well. And sometimes these banal interactions actually lead to nascent social networks and even friendships. It remains open what we do in a lot of literature on urban diversity. People talk about in cities there's a widespread indifference to difference. People sometimes just don't care if people look differently, act differently, talk differently. There's modes of civility, just some kind of rules that kick in, how we're nice to each other and hold doors open for each other and things like that in cities, in a lot of places. Or what the great sociologist Zimmel talked about as a kind of urban reserve, that people just have a reserved kind of rational, not quite respect, but a way of dealing with each other in urban environments that's neither positive nor negative. So that's why I said I'm not sure how to include the neutral stuff in this definition of cosmopolitanism that I'll be talking about, but you get the general idea, I think. Right, okay. So as I'll come to, right now in a lot of social science literature on diversity in cities, it's kind of expected that cosmopolitanism is what cities are all about, especially as they become more and more diverse. But it hasn't always been that way in social science. I mean, going back to you always have to do an urban talk, going back to the Chicago school. And in the Chicago school, the way they had this kind of spatial ecology of groups and transition zones and so forth in cities like Chicago, they really didn't talk about things like cosmopolitanism, about how the mixing of people led to changes in attitudes. They really talked about, in this ecology model, about how groups remained rather separate and didn't interact in great ways and how they moved around cities and so forth. So that wasn't this really kind of generator of cosmopolitan model. Also, since the time of the Chicago School and right up until now, the study of urban segregation is a massive field, a massive literature with all kinds of sophisticated ways of entangling and looking at extent or density of segregation, of ethnic segregation. But again, segregation studies don't really lead you to a cosmopolitan idea. Again, it's mainly about how groups are clustered in certain areas and don't actually interact, is one of the messages you can get out of a lot of segregation literature. And another very popular type of literature existed mainly in anthropology from, let's say, the late 50s until the 1970s, urban community studies, or the so-called ethnic city. So lots of studies of American blacks, Puerto Ricos, Cubans, the Italian ghetto, and so forth. This is what anthropologists tended to look at, kind of importing their village study model into cities and looking at discrete communities. Again, it was a long-standing approach to urban diversity that didn't really talk about generation of cosmopolitanism. It was more about groups staying separate and living their own cultural lives. And all of this has led in, I would say, in a lot of the public imagination to what I call the pin the ethnic group on the map view of urban diversity. That when you talk to people about urban diversity, they think this is where the Jamaicans live, this is where the Colombians live, this is where the Chinese live. And this was underpinned by a now kind of famous map in The Guardian of London, this idea of London, a world in one city, and it listed 100 different groups and where they lived in London. And I thought this was interesting, but completely the wrong way to think about urban diversity, and certainly not one that makes you think about generation of cosmopolitanism. This was much more in line with segregation studies and the kind of Chicago ecological model. And it also led to this kind of understanding of cities, that is that you have Chinatowns and little Armenias and little Tokyos and so forth. Every big city has a little somewhere or other. And again, this idea of pin the ethnic group on the map. So I'm just saying that what has come to be regarded as this cosmopolitan generator has a lot of discourse and a lot of academic study over a long term kind of leading against that view. Nevertheless, there have been several breakthrough studies that have led us to a different understanding of urban diversity. And at this point in the lecture gives me the opportunity to talk about the work of a dear friend of mine who died a few years ago, Gerrit Bauman, and I think his book, Contesting Culture, which I make a lot of my students read, was one of these kind of breakthroughs in the study of urban diversity. That is, it was at the height of a time, this was 1996, there was still rampant this idea of ethnic communities. Anthropologists mostly studied this or that ethnic community within a city. And Bauman did something different. He looked at Southall and West London just as a space of discourse about culture. He didn't start off with Indians or Sikhs or Jamaicans or whatever. He just looked at a space and did an ethnography of a space and the way people talked about cultures and communities. And I thought, for me, it led to a real breakthrough about thinking about diversity in cities, and particularly spaces, which we'll come to as well. So this is where I get to the current literature. I'd say over the past 10 years, but increasingly until now, we've got a lot more publications across the social sciences, geography, sociology, anthropology in particular, which I would say fit in with this idea of cities as generators of cosmopolitanism. And they use lots of different language: intercultural experience, conviviality, living with difference, spaces of difference, multiculture, etc. And these are just books. I mean, we could give a list of articles the length of my arm as well. This seems to be the state of the art right now, I would suggest. Looking at how people interact in new creative ways, creating new multicultures, new hybrid cultures, and so forth in cities all around Europe and the USA and other places as well. Now, for all of these studies, whether they kind of know it or acknowledge it or not, I think all of these studies that talk about particular urban spaces and the generation of cosmopolitan attitudes and practices all pretty much rely on the contact hypothesis, going back to social psychology of the 1950s, Gordon Allport. And this idea that when one has positive contact, which can mean various things, with a member of another, often negatively stereotyped group, it can often improve attitudes. Now, it's not across the board. There are certain conditions, and Allport and a whole 2 generations of social psychologists since Allport have set up all sorts of conditions that have to be met for this attitude-changing contact to take place. Nevertheless, I'll just accept most of the literature that says this seems to work. And I refer to a famous article in 2006, Pettigrew and Trop, that did a meta-analysis of 500 studies of contact, and they basically show that contact works. Okay? Positive contact with others changes attitudes and does generate this kind of cosmopolitanism we talk about. And actually, in our institute, we did a large-scale diversity and contact study. I throw this in here. I'm going to talk about some more work at the institute. It's part of the job description here to promote the research of the institute. So it's all very relevant stuff as well. So we had a large-scale diversity and contact project. 16 German cities, 50 neighborhoods, 2,500 people in a 3-wave survey, 5 areas studied in ethnographic detail, looking at levels of diversity in particular neighborhoods and how that affects what kind of contact people have, how much contact people have, how they value that contact, and what kind of social networks develop out of that. And I won't go through all the kinds of analyses and findings we had, except to say that overall, the findings not only reproduce a lot of the contact literature, but we think go a bit beyond it. That yes, even fleeting contacts, small exchanges that people have on the street can improve attitudes towards other groups. And we did this both looking at various kinds of foreigners, as they're called in Germany, and Germans, and looking at it from both perspectives. And not only that, but over time, because it was a 3-wave study, we showed that these attitudes improve, and indeed weak and sometimes even strong ties develop between people. So that's all to say that yes, I think the contact theory does work in the case of cities and the enhancement of cosmopolitan attitudes. Whoops, I want to have this advert thrown up here for the book that came out of the diversity in context study, okay? First advert for the afternoon. Okay, also inherently based on a contact theory, whether it's recognized or not, much contemporary urban planning studies are based on this idea that you put people in the right kind of space and give them the right kind of contacts and opportunities to engage with each other, and you will have positive engagement and changing people's attitudes, okay? Say you look across urban planning literature, and this is the basic idea: social mixing, exposure to diversity, so that urban planners are taught to create spaces where people can have these sorts of encounters to generate more cosmopolitan attitudes. Okay. Again, not only in the state of the art of a lot of current literature across the social sciences talks about basically the generation of cosmopolitan attitudes and practices, but it's done by way of re-examining notions of space as well. So here are just examples, again, in much current literature, ideas of spaces of encounter. It's a kind of Lefebvrean view of how social engagement creates space and how space conditions social interactions and so forth. And so much in the study of urban diversity is very much in this idea of spaces of encounter and difference. Okay, and again, lo and behold, here at our institute, we had a large-scale study of interactions and diversification in space. It was a 5-year project, very large team of sociologists, geographers, and anthropologists, so very multidisciplinary as well. 18 months of field work, overall 5-year of study, films, books, etc., coming out of this. The study was done in specifically selected spaces in neighborhoods of Singapore, New York, and Johannesburg. I won't go into all the reasons and rationales why these cities, why these neighborhoods, why these spaces. It's all in a book and several articles that came out. I'll give references eventually. But the idea, again, was to look in particular spaces, how these spaces conditioned the way that people who've been living there for a long time, including previous waves of immigrants and newcomers, interacted, and what kind of patterns of interaction arose out of those encounters. And would there be any kind of similarities or differences? How do we account for those similarities and differences in the way that people interact in public spaces? And to demonstrate the findings of this, I'll show a 4-minute clip from one of the global diversity films where we talk specifically about 3 patterns of interaction in spaces across these 3 cities that we found during the research.
The process of final data analysis started in 2014 at the Institute, where the whole team again gathered together to analyze a range of data and to address the project's core research concerns. The project members identified a considerable array of differences in diversification processes, impacts and emergent socio-spatial patterns, that is, recurrent patterns of interaction in particular public spaces. They called these root-ins, rooms without walls and corridors of dissociation. The new term root-ins summarizes patterns of encounter that arise from fleeting interactions, as well as regular observations of others along habitual routes to work, school, shopping, or leisure activities. Through such root-ins, people see change in their neighborhoods and come to read others, particularly newcomers who eventually become familiar strangers. Rooms without walls is a concept referring to groups of people within large urban spaces who carve out their own smaller spaces of interaction in parks, streets, or shopping malls. The basis of these groups is usually some form of affinity, shared interest, or identity. By seeing changing groups and their rooms without walls, residents come to gradually view and interpret the diversification of their neighborhoods. Corridors of dissociation are sociospatial patterns of social segregation, whereby people are barred from places and opportunities of encounter, either by their own decisions or directly, possibly violently, by others. Corridors of dissociation demonstrate that diversification processes often generate not just new patterns of social interaction, but also new patterns of social exclusion. The project team found these three sociospatial patterns occur in all places.
Amongst the key findings of the Global Diversities Project, we found that, well, yes, as we expected, the rise of superdiversity and processes of migrant-driven diversification are to be found in different kinds of cities, different kinds of societies throughout the world. And of course, the exact configurations of these and the groups involved and how these processes unfold are very much contextualized by the local settings. That's not a surprise. But what we did find interestingly, that there are these common patterns of the way that diversification actually plays out in public space. That is, the ways that newcomers adopt themselves and are adopted by others in public settings. And these are these sociospatial patterns that we talk about.
The findings of the Global Diversities Research Project will significantly advance social scientific knowledge concerning global diversification trends and will contribute critically to understanding how the world's rapidly growing cities are being shaped by migration throughout the 21st century.
Okay, and there's the advert number 2 for that book that came out of the project. Okay, so one of the points of that is that we found in the Global Diversities Project, in these different sociospatial patterns, ones that are leaning more towards what we could call an urban cosmopolitanism, but also ones that develop into greater forms of exclusion as well. So we can't just rely on this idea of spaces of encounter, spaces of difference as a one-way street, despite the truth, if it's that, of contact theory and so forth. There are all sorts of other reasons why interactions in public spaces might not produce the cosmopolitanism that we think about. Certain spaces might become exclusive spaces, like we're talking about these rooms without walls. Neighborhoods change due to things like white flight or gated communities. People might actually be withdrawing from social interaction altogether. This is the famous Putnam thesis of hunkering down. Or there can be what we can call kind of co-presence without contact, i.e. people liking to live in diverse areas but not really engaging with people. And this is often a critique made against gentrifiers, people who like to live in these diverse neighborhoods in places like New York and so forth, but who keep the others really at a difference. They just like them as a kind of backdrop. Okay? We also have to consider how residential diversity and contact is related to contact in places like workplaces, leisure facilities, schools, and transportation. I'll come back to that a little bit towards the end as well. Okay? Now, there are two other processes or sets of phenomena that I want to flag up that, that counter the urban generator of cosmopolitan model of cities. And this is what I call a kind of geography of diversity fear, or the fear of diversification. And this is particularly in areas we can see undergoing rapid ethnic change, however small. And this is the important point I want to make, and I'll show some data. Small but rapid ethnic change freaks people out and might lead to xenophobic tendencies. Okay, and this goes back to a much older literature as well, 1992. And there's another set of phenomena looked at increasingly in a certain set of literature, particular political geography literature, called the halo effect. About xenophobic populism is highest in areas right next to highly diverse areas. Okay, not the diverse areas themselves, but just on the edge. And it's unfortunate that it's called the halo effect. I mean, that sounds kind of virtuous. I think it should be called something like a rubber tire effect or something like that. But anyways, there is some literature that calls it a halo effect, this idea of it's just outside of diverse areas that sometimes you have the highest xenophobia. And I gave a talk using some of this sort of stuff at a conference not so long ago, and some people were saying, well, but isn't this all just racism? Well, I don't think it's just racism. I don't think racism is just racism. I think there are lots of things going on. And in this case, and I'll go on and we can come back to it at the end, sure, there might be some inherent racism in certain populations, but when they're undergoing these effects, the rapid but small ethnic change, or this being on a periphery of a super diverse area, this racism combines with certain kinds of fear, or what's called again in an older literature, status anxiety, that perpetuates modes of racism and perception. And it's an endless circle of fear and racism, I think, that can get generated by this. So some evidence of, some broad evidence of rapid ethnic change. Sorry, I'm American, I can't keep away from the Trump phenomenon. But I thought this is the kind of stuff I'm talking about on a larger scale, not on a particular urban scale. That is, here's a Wall Street Journal article that they found that in the places most unsettled by rapid demographic change were the ones more likely to vote for Trump. And in the US, of course, they use this kind of fivefold racial categorization. So they're talking about racial change, okay? The areas that diversified rapidly were most likely to vote for Trump. And this was also found in a different way by the Washington Post, the increasing diversity of the US, okay, that rapid change is coming to a lot of areas. And so basically, if you can't see, particularly we can let the colors do the talking, the yellow areas, and to a lesser extent the green, but mainly the yellow areas were places that were low in diversity in the first place, and just over the last 10 years or so, or since 2000, okay, 17 years, have gone through small but rapid demographic change, ethnic change, okay? And the green areas were, there was hardly any diversity in the first place and hardly had any change. So you've got both a kind of halo effect and this rapid ethnic change effect, yeah? And if you look at the areas around the Great Lakes, Iowa, Michigan, and so forth, those are areas of some of the highest rapid, or the most rapid ethnic change, and these are the areas where Trump increased the Republican vote dramatically. Now, I know there's lots of other reasons why people voted Trump and so forth, but I'm saying that amongst all those other reasons, this fear of diversification should be folded in with it and tried to understood alongside of it, okay? And again, it's a fear based on a perception, not on actual contact or experience in most cases. And this is exemplified by one Republican activist who said, I think it's more the unknown than the actual problem, she said, of her neighbors uncomfortable with increased diversity. It's more of a perceived problem than an actual problem. Again, pointing to a kind of fear or anxiety caused by diversification. A similar sort of thing with Brexit as well. I've got lots more data on this, but I'll just show this one slide from The Economist, where To the left of the screen, we have vote to remain in the European Union. To the right, we have votes to leave, yeah, the Brexit vote. And in those areas with the most immigrants, upper left of the screen, people voted overwhelmingly to stay. And most studies show that Brexit was a kind of proxy for immigration. Okay, and a lot of work has been done on this. So not surprisingly, well, the areas with high immigrants were more cosmopolitan, more pro-immigration and so forth, not only because they're immigrants themselves, but this is where this idea of the cosmopolitanization effect of highly diverse areas would seem to make sense. However, lower right hand, these are the areas that have diversified the most quickly, yeah, in the past 10 years, from 2001 to 2014. Small but rapid change, and you see that they voted overwhelmingly to leave. Okay, these are some of the kinds of effects that we're talking about then, by way of halo and rapid ethnic change. Here's more example of halo effect just in London. Now the upper left map is a particular kind of diversity index that looks at the change in the number of people of 10 different ethnic minorities, the increases in the concentration of these 10 different ethnic groups in London over 10 years. And we see one area in particular, Redbridge, around Newham, Hackney, these sorts of areas. The most super diverse areas of London, okay? And it's in the area right next to that that you had the highest Brexit vote, the only place in London that voted for Brexit, the only place in London where you have a high UKIP vote as well, and it's actually the most segregated part of London, and that's high segregation of white, working class people in an area right next to the most diverse areas of London. So again, a clear indication of a kind of halo effect as well. Of course, there's lots of other things you can look at ethnographically or in kind of deep political science and social psychology and so forth as well. But nevertheless, these kinds of indicators are quite strong. Okay, coming to the Rotterdam thing. First, just to introduce Rotterdam, you've got the municipality of Rotterdam showed on this map. And Rotterdam is now over 50% people of migrant background, okay? So what I'm going to be talking about in the next few slides is both the municipality of Rotterdam and Greater Rotterdam, the areas right around it too, and it'll be clear to you which ones I'm talking about, okay? So again, one of the first things, the PVV, that's Wilders' party, and he came a very close second in the national elections in Rotterdam, the only big Dutch city where he had a large-scale vote. And people are trying to think about why that is in a city that's over half people of migration background as well. Okay, so that kind of flies in the face, like I'm saying, of the kind of cosmopolitan understanding of diverse cities. Okay, now there have been some recent studies looking at the elections. This is one of the first ones I could find, where these Dutch colleagues, political scientists, did an analysis, and across the Netherlands, they found that indeed places where there were recent increases in ethnic minorities are positively related in the data to the likelihood of voting for Wilders. So it's again that rapid ethnic change thesis on why people react as they do, just even in urban areas. However, they also found, and just threw in there, that in areas, regardless of how rapid and extensive the change, once they reckon you reach a threshold of over 30% of the population, these positive contact experiences actually lessen the PVV vote, okay? But again, how they square that specifically with places like Rotterdam, I wasn't quite sure, because this was a kind of Netherlands-wide study. So Rotterdam, you did have fairly rapid ethnic change. So this is over the last 20 years. The two colors, I mean, the way the Dutch do this, non-Western foreigners, is that a good translation for allochthone? non-Western and Western foreigners, and then Dutch, autochthone. And basically, 1997, so 20 years ago, you had about 35% people of migration background, going up to now 50% and more. So that's fairly rapid ethnic change in the municipality of Rotterdam. So that could sort of partially explain some of the vote for Wilders and so forth. I'll come back to look more in depth at Rotterdam itself, but more to the point here about a kind of halo effect. So here's Rotterdam itself. I don't know if you'll be able to pick this up on film. The municipality of Rotterdam. Two places right next to super diverse Rotterdam were places that actually did entirely capture a PVV vote. Yeah? These places that are gray on the map, hard to see because this is the ocean and so forth. But there's only 3 places in all of Netherlands that got that really strong PVV vote, and 2 of them are on the outskirts of Rotterdam. Okay? Schiedam and Nissewaard. Now, Nissewaard is actually comprised now of 2 areas, and Nissewaard hardly has any people of migration background. And Spijkenisse, pretty acceptable Dutch, also has a fairly low level, had a little bit of a rise, but basically are largely ethnic Dutch areas. So you can talk about a halo effect there. In Schiedam, I think you have both rapid ethnic change, going from about 25% to about 45% in 20 years, plus a halo effect. It's a largely white area right on the edge of Rotterdam, of super diverse Rotterdam. So I think these sort of fit the pictures, because otherwise, it's again my question, what's the matter with Rotterdam? What's the matter with Nissewaard and Schiedam? That these are the only places really in the Netherlands, aside from one far in the east, that solidly voted for Geert Wilders. Okay, so now going into the municipality of Rotterdam itself, this Livable Rotterdam Party, which, as I say, came out of the Pim Fortuyn sort of movement. They're still the largest party. They're in coalition government right now, populist, right-wing, anti-immigrant. In Rotterdam itself, how do we explain that? Well, of course, the vote for the city council isn't entirely even across the country. And first we want to look at this kind of ethnic map. I don't know how, it doesn't appear so good on this large screen, but basically comparing Rotterdam, and the darker the color, according to this map that I was able to get, the darker the color here, the greater the ethnic diversity, the number of people of various migrant background. And between 1996 and 2016, you can play this online over time, and you see this gradual darkening of the area. So basically, this central part of Rotterdam is super diverse. I mean, you walk down the streets there, and it's one of the most diverse places I've ever been to, except maybe for Amsterdam. So you've got this super diverse core of the city right here. But then when you look at the areas with the highest livable Rotterdam vote in Rotterdam, the places with most representatives in the city area committees that are divided up. And again, it's a perfect halo effect. The areas just outside of this super diverse core of the city. Okay, so I think that helps explain why. Because now, of course, you'd say, well, there's this is an area mainly of migrants. They're not going to be voting for livable Rotterdam, so it's no secret that there's no livable Rotterdam vote there. Yeah, absolutely, I accept that. But that doesn't explain why there is high livable Rotterdam vote on the periphery areas, except if something like the halo effect is taking place. People freaking out, they're on the edge of something that they're seeing and they're afraid of it. They're afraid of it coming to their areas. Okay, so starting to sum up this idea of geographies of diversity fear, both combining these kind of proto-theories of rapid ethnic change and halo effect. Going back to that old social science that I was talking about, there's still echoes of it. We can't completely throw Chicago school and segregation studies out of the window and so forth. Matter of fact, in a lot of ways, this idea of geographies of diversity fear bring back those kinds of studies, because yes, the spatial ecology of a Chicago school is there in these ideas of halo effect and zones of transition, and as one area changes, it has effect on the areas next to it and so forth. I think that's very Chicago school sort of stuff. And yes, segregation is a crucial element in a lot of this stuff, but we're talking about segregation of the white nativist population. And the higher their concentration is next to areas of diversity, it's having an effect. This ethnic city thing, I would say, is lessening as cities diversify anyways. We're finding less and less ethnic concentrations in most large cities. So I would say as a phenomenon in the data, it's lessening, and certainly as a social science approach, you don't really find these kind of urban village studies anymore. As I say, the trend now is to look at these spaces of contact, interaction, and difference and so forth. Okay? So before I come to the last slide, I still raise this thing about the role of contact in all of these things and how contact relates to rapid ethnic change and the halo effect. And linked to that is this idea of fear and status anxiety and places of residence. So what I'm meaning here is that for whites who live in highly segregated neighborhoods right next to super diverse areas, of course they're not living their entire lives from sunrise to sunset in those areas. They're going out to work, going out to school, going out to play football and have leisure activities in other parts of the city. So they are likely having contact with diverse others all over the place. Why doesn't that generate a cosmopolitanism back home? Why is there still this halo effect? Well, maybe it has to do with this idea of residence, i.e., I'm just throwing this out there. It's okay for me to have contact and be more cosmopolitan out there or when I'm in my workplace. When I'm at home, I'm afraid of that diversity coming here. Yeah? So I think this is all researchable stuff. I kind of advocate that we should look at these sorts of things and how contact in different sorts of areas relate to each other and relate to how people feel about those places where they live. Because we do see increasing trends sometimes due to white flight and gated communities of white nativists grouping themselves more and more as cities become super diverse. Okay, so concluding thoughts, last slide. Well, I hope it's got people thinking different ways about urban diversity, whether you sort of buy the argument about halo effect and the effects of rapid but small diversification. Main thing is that despite a lot of the literature right now that suggests that we can't rely on cities being generators of cosmopolitanism. I think it certainly happens. Cities should generate these kind of cosmopolitan attitudes. A lot of contact studies and studies like our own Diversity and Contact Project shows that over time, that is the tendency, but again, we can't absolutely rely on it because at the same time, if you have changing geographies of diversity fear, that might be countering a lot of the effects of contact and this generation of cosmopolitanism. Is it just a matter of time? I tend to think so. I tend to hope so. I'll put my normative hand on my heart. I'm for an urban cosmopolitan future, but we can't actually count on it. And so going back to my very first slide about how some of these populist, xenophobic narratives tend to strike home in some cities and in some parts of the cities, I would say, again, we need to understand what the nature of the geography of diversity fear is. And if we are to look for a more positive urban cosmopolitan future, we have to think about how to create counter-narratives to those other kinds of narratives that are leading to greater xenophobia, and particularly in urban areas where we don't always expect it. So thanks very much for listening, and we'll continue with discussion. And I think on our Facebook site, you can send in any comments and criticism that you've got. Thanks a lot.